People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512.
Virgin Media Channel 604.
Freesat Channel 216.
Freeview Channel 236.
And YouView Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB Plus Radio.
With the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. for Gloria Meets. In exclusive interviews, I'll be finding out who our politicians really are and what they really think.
It's something that you would never want anyone to suffer.
I didn't know what channels there were. I didn't think I'd be believed.
I must have weighed about 7 stone and I'm 5'8".
My instincts was to sort of cover this up. I mean, clearly that was a mistake.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday on GB News, it's Bev Turner Today from 10 a.m. We're going to be here for you, our GB News family, to keep you up to date, but also make you smile.
The guy went from puberty to adultery.
And I can't wait to bring a few of my own opinions.
I have no time for cultural totalitarianism.
We'll engage in passionate, but always polite debate, with your thoughts and opinions at the centre of it all. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Dubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you.
She's only teasing. Go on.
He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Dubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
Hello and welcome. This is Calvin's Common Sense Crusade with me, the Reverend Calvin Robinson, on your TV, online and on your wireless. Today we'll be discussing the revelations in a new book on NHS child gender clinics and how staff regret routinely referring under-16s for puberty blockers. British weapons could be made in Ukraine as part of a new deal to bring Ukraine closer to NATO. Is this a good move or a dangerous war provocation? And of course, we'll be discussing how the Church of England is considering gender-neutral terms for God. But first, it's the news with Ray Addison.
Thanks, Calvin. Rapidly approaching 1 minute past 3. Here's the latest. The number of people that have died in earthquakes in Turkey and Syria has risen to more than 33,000. It comes as Turkey has ordered 113 suspects be detained in connection with the construction of buildings that collapsed in the disaster last Monday. Some rescue operations have been halted in the country after reports of looting, whilst hundreds of thousands of people have been made homeless in the middle of winter.
The search and rescue operations are probably coming to an end because it has been almost a week now. And although yesterday there were some survivors who have been rescued from under the rubble, I think it is probably coming to an end. Now, the most important thing is the sustainability of the survivors and to create the living conditions for them, because it is very difficult. There's still no electricity and no heating.
That was Ünal Sevikal, the former Turkish ambassador to the United Kingdom. Now, a man has been charged in connection with disarray outside a hotel housing asylum seekers in Knowsley on Friday night. 19-year-old Jared Skeet from Liverpool has been charged with violent disorder and assault. He'll appear at Wirral Adult Remand Court tomorrow. Merseyside Police is saying that the violence, with fireworks being thrown at officers and a police van set on fire, left one officer and 2 members of the public injured. 14 other people who were arrested have been released on bail. The Labour Party is urging the BBC chairman to consider his position after MPs found that he'd breached standards when applying for the role. The cross-party committee says that Richard Sharp made significant errors of judgment when he failed to declare that he'd helped Boris Johnson to secure a loan when he was Prime Minister. Shadow Culture Secretary Lucy Powell is questioning whether he's still able to uphold trust and independence at the broadcaster.
His damning report, it really is an unprecedented report, means that Mr Sharp's position is increasingly untenable, and he really should now reflect on whether he's able to carry out that very important role as the BBC chair to uphold public trust and independence of the BBC.
The chair of the Commons Defence Committee is urging Rishi Sunak to boost defence spending due to threats of a new Cold War. Tory MP Tobias Ellwood told GB News that we need more money to replace military equipment and deal with aggression from Russia and China. It comes after reports that some NATO allies are concerned about the UK's military readiness.
Still on a peacetime budget, we've moved into a new era of insecurity. I make it really clear, we're still in denial. Another Cold War has started, not on one front, but on two fronts, with Russia and China. And my concern is that Russia and China are now going to coalesce, are now going to merge together, knowing that they can exploit the international rules-based order unless we stand up.
Tobias Ellwood MP. Now, the brother of murdered 2-year-old James Bulger says he'll never forgive the killers 3 decades after the crime. James was snatched from a shopping centre and killed by 2 men formerly known as John Venables and Robert Thompson when they were aged 10 in Merseyside in 1993. John Venables is currently behind bars, and Michael Fergus says he should stay there to give justice for James. The search for missing mum Nicola Bulley is now in its 17th day as police continue to investigate her disappearance. Today, yellow ribbons with messages of hope have been tied to a bridge over the River Wyre near where Miss Bulley was last seen. She disappeared on the 27th of January while walking her dog shortly after dropping her 2 daughters off at school. Lancashire Police says it's keeping an open mind in its appeal for information. Workers at Heathrow Airport are set to vote on whether to stage fresh strikes after rejecting their latest pay offer. Unite says over 3,000 of its members, including security guards and engineers, will begin the month-long ballot on the 17th of February. The union says that the offer of a 10% increase amounts to a pay cut when compared to the rate of inflation. And a second unidentified flying object has been shot down by the US military, this time over Canada. Canadian forces will now recover and analyse the wreckage of the cylindrical object. It's believed to be similar to the Chinese surveillance balloon, which was shot down off the coast of the United States about a week ago. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. Now let's get back to Father Calvin.
The Church of England has been all over the news this week because Synod, the governing body of the COE, voted after a lengthy process to allow the blessing of same-sex relationships. This has caused tidal waves in the wider Anglican communion. The traditional Christian view is that marriage is between one man and one woman, and that sex outside of marriage is sinful, therefore unable to be blessed by God. There are those of us who now see the Church of England as apostates because of what I would call heretical teaching, and the Church of England is at risk, serious risk, of being renounced from the Anglican communion. Many publications are conflating Anglicanism with the C of E, so I'd like to take this opportunity to explain the difference. Anglicanism, as the name would suggest, is the English expression of the Christian faith. When the English spread Christianity around the world, we shared the Anglican tradition post-Reformation, part of the one holy Catholic and apostolic faith. Anglicans are both Catholic and Reformed. After Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodox, it is the 3rd largest communion in the world. A group of Anglican leaders, known as primates, met in 2008 at the Global Anglican Future Conference, GAFCON, over concerns of what they called a rising false gospel. They were concerned that the Episcopal Church of America, and now the Church of England, might be departing from biblical teaching. Today, GAFCON represents over 35 million active Anglicans in the worldwide communion. For perspective, there are just around 13 million Anglicans in the UK. GAFCON is the majority, representing over 75% of Anglicans worldwide. Last year, we interviewed the chairman of GAFCON, the Most Reverend Dr. Foley Beach, on this very show. So why is any of this important? In a statement released on Thursday, immediately after the announcement regarding same-sex blessings in the C of E, the Global South, that's the majority African arm of Anglicans who will be attending GAFCON, said that the Church of England has now joined those provinces with which communion is impaired. They made the point that that whatever the legal advice that the C of E's doctrine of marriage has not changed, we hold the well-established view that Anglican liturgy expresses its doctrine. As a result, they will be taking divisive steps towards resetting the Anglican communion. If the majority of Anglicans are rejecting what they call the false gospel of the Church of England and choose to renounce the See of Canterbury, the question then arises, can the Church of England survive on its own, or will it be forced to repent and rejoin the fold? Hello and welcome to the Common Sense Crusade with me, Calvin Robinson. Here is what's coming up this afternoon. A new book claims more than 1,000 children were referred for puberty blockers at an experimental gender clinic, where concerns were ignored to preserve a gold dust NHS contract. Will this make us think twice when implementing controversial policies too soon in the future? Then I have a sit-down with historian David Starkey on why he believes universal human rights do not exist, as we delve into the ongoing debate on whether the UK should leave the ECHR. And later on, the Church of England is considering whether to stop referring to God as He after questions concerning the use of gender-neutral terms were raised by priests. Is this a vain attempt to gain more younger followers or a genuine attempt to update the Church's teachings? And of course, you can join in any of our discussions by emailing gbviews@gbnews.uk or by tweeting @gbnews. Deus Volt. A new book which looks at the inside story of the collapse of the Tavistock's gender service for children claims that more than 1,000 children were referred for puberty blockers. There are also claims in the book that concerns were alleged or allegedly ignored to preserve a gold dust NHS contract. Former clinicians at the Gender Identity Development Service have detailed how some incredibly complex children were placed on medication after one face-to-face assessment, despite some having a variety of mental health or family background difficulties. Former clinicians at the service reflect for the first time in detail of their regret about the practice of routinely referring under-16s for puberty blocking and cross-hormone treatment with no concrete data on the long-term effects. Joining me now is former editor of Labour List Peter Edwards and the executive editor of The Critic, Sebastian Milbank. Now, Peter, those of us who would say that embracing trans ideology too soon without any concrete data is bound to raise problems like this, have been saying it for a while. Should it have been more obvious to us?
Well, I don't want to use the word ideology. I think we'd all agree we want trans people to be treated with dignity, but I want to talk about the science of it, which is I don't see why it's appropriate, excuse me, for anyone under the age of 18 to have life-altering drugs of this nature, because it is very difficult to give informed consent. Obviously, the Sunday Times have run, in effect, a campaign on this reporting over many months and described today in a book extract regret and second thoughts by some of the children who perhaps may now be over the age of 18 who've had these drugs, which are irreversible. But I come back to this point, which is and I'm sure everyone watching wants trans people to be treated with dignity, but it's a failure of medical regulation for people under the age of 18 to have irreversible changes made to their body.
Right, and we've read in this report from the book that people were given puberty blockers as a thinking process, as a time to decide whether they wanted the life-altering drugs that came later. But pretty much everyone that went on those puberty blockers ended up taking irreversible drugs, didn't they?
I believe so. I haven't read the book. I've read the extract in the Sunday Times today. Yeah. There are different ways into this, and I think one of the points you alluded to is if a child has questions of this nature, and lots of the children involved had other medical issues as well, perhaps like mental health problems or were on the autistic spectrum, then there's a range of support they need before making this irreversible, life-changing decision about your identity.
And is that not the problem, Sebastian, in that we are talking about a life-altering decision here, and we're talking about vulnerable children, the most vulnerable children in society, that a lot of them had been sexually abused, a lot of them were mentally ill, a lot of them had, high traits of autism, a lot of them had family issues going on. Are we not letting down, or have we not been letting down these vulnerable children?
We certainly have been letting them down. And I think the problem is that when you... we look at all of the mismanagement that's gone on here, all of the ethically questionable decisions. And it's not that one institution has gone wrong, it's that when you begin at the wrong point, everything will go wrong. Right. And the point that they've begun at is being willing to prescribe a drug, puberty blockers, which, except in very extreme cases of things like precocious puberty, are not a medically appropriate drug to give to any healthy child. Because this is stuff that will destroy your bone structure. It's things that will delay the normal onset of puberty. It has a huge number of psychological and physiological effects on the body that are incredibly harmful. We
call them puberty blockers, but they're actually chemical castration, aren't they?
Absolutely. And, the FDA's, I think they have something like 10,000 negative side effects of this drug. And the suggestion that any clinician is giving this to a healthy child, that should never have been on the table.
Right.
And if you've got a process where you're giving a drug that under no circumstances should you be giving it to any of the patients coming before you, and you've got to choose which one to give it to, it's not a surprise that they weren't making good decisions, because there wasn't a good decision to make in their process.
Right. So bringing that back to Peter, I mean, you say it's not an ideology, but when people, after one face-to-face meeting, are being put on these drugs, it seems to me that somewhere along the line, people are wanting to affirm the trans movement and the trans ideology, as I would call it. Is it going to hurt future young people who do identify as trans?
Yeah, well, I didn't quite say that. I said ideology wasn't a word I would use, because there's different ways into it. But, I think your question is really about what happens next, isn't it?
Yeah.
GIDS, the clinic, as I understand it, has been closed down. As often the case with campaigning journalism, there's been a welter of coverage. I'd imagine that there'll be a government review, and I think we can all expect to see medical regulatory guidance rewritten, because I'd imagine, and this is not at all a party political point, it's hard to see a government and a Conservative government giving a green light to these changes for a child.
Yeah, I think it's one of the biggest scandals we've seen in a long time. I could honestly spend the whole show talking about just this book, but we do have to move on. So I'd like to read a response from the Tavistock. We did reach out to the Tavistock and Portman NHS Trust, who told us, works on a case-by-case basis with every young person and their family, working thoughtfully and holistically with them to explore their situation with no expectation of what the right outcome for them might be. Only the minority of young people seen in the service are referred for any physical interventions. At the Tavistock and Portman, we wholeheartedly support our staff to raise concerns and have recently strengthened our mechanisms for doing so. Concerns relating to young people's well-being are taken seriously and investigated. On to our next topic. British weaponry and military vehicles could be manufactured in the Ukraine, under plans that would mark a deepening of the country's ties with NATO. But some critics say that this is simply stoking the fire and further provoking stronger reactions from Putin. And earlier this week, Ukrainian President Zelensky renewed his call for fighter jets during a visit to the UK, where he addressed both houses of Parliament. But Defence Secretary Ben Wallace says there will be no immediate transfer of UK fighter jets to the Ukraine, but he did not completely rule out sending aircraft to the Ukraine. Now, still with me in the studio is Peter and Sebastian. I'll start with you this time, Sebastian. What do you make of this? Are we stoking the flames of World War III?
Well, I don't think we're stoking the flames of World War III. That would be Russia. Obviously, the West can make things worse for its response. We do need to think about that. I mean, my biggest concern in all this is it's one thing to send weapons to Ukraine, although I would say we've so degraded our military capacity in a number of areas that we simply aren't in a position to give a certain sorts of weapons, including jets. But I have a specific concerns about the idea that we should manufacture British kit in Ukraine. We're talking about one of the world's most corrupt countries. We're talking about a conflict zone where the factions will be vulnerable to attack by Russia. Again, it's one of those, as in so many cases, we're driven by sentiment when there is, and there is clearly a moral commitment that we have to help Ukraine, but we don't know what's going to happen in 5 years, in 10 years, in 15 years. Do we want to, take, things like, the Eurofighter Typhoon, this is something hundreds of You know, over 100 billion has been spent on this project. You know, we're talking, you know, British tanks, stuff where we've poured investment research into them. Do we really want to transfer that with little regulation and oversight into Ukraine? And I don't think we do.
I mean, Sebastian raises some very good points, Peter. I would suggest that we are driven by sentiment to the point that actually what we're seeing right now is hero worship. It's idolatry around Zelensky and the Ukraine. And many people rightly are concerned about Ukraine citizens and Russian citizens in this war. However, we're putting Zelensky on a pedestal and forgetting that this is the leader of one of the most corrupt countries in the world. Should we really be producing British weaponry over there?
There's a lot there, so I wouldn't call it idolatry at all. I think that's completely the wrong word. But if Zelensky is on a pedestal, I think that's the right place for him to be, because I think his leadership has been phenomenal, and there's actually kind of a consensus across the political spectrum about that. It's very interesting listening to previous answers, because I think one thing we can all agree on is we don't know what will happen next. But it's clear that any UK government, you know, before or after a general election under Truss, Johnson, Sunak or Labour, will go as far as it possibly can to support Zelensky without having a direct military confrontation with Putin. And I do say Putin because our fight is not with ordinary Russian folk who have no say in this, it's with the leadership. But
it's not our fight.
Yeah. We're
not at war.
No, we're not at war, and I'm very glad we're not at war, but it's still a moral issue, and that's why I believe the level of support is going to be ramped up, because we're making pledges now that perhaps 6 or 9 months ago weren't really conceived of. But of course, we know the war is going on 3 months, 6 months, now it's a year. Could it be 2 years? Clearly, Putin has tacked back, and he's had to adjust his aims, and it looks like he might now settle for trying to partition part of the country, which is still a completely wicked act. But I come back to my starting point, which is the British government, whoever is in charge, is going to have to keep upping the level of militarily and personnel support up to the point that Ukraine wins, because it is inconceivable for the West and for Europe that Ukraine does not win.
That is interesting to me, Sebastian, the idea that the only way for this war to ever be over is if Ukraine wins. Who's pushing for peace?
Well, I think victory is... I think probably what will happen is both sides are going to declare victory. I think we don't need to concern ourselves with what Ukraine wants and what Russia wants, except as a secondary concern, but we need to be concerned with what do we want as the NATO alliance and as Britain. And I think what we want is an end to this conflict as soon as possible, and for Putin to not so advance his position that it's a threat to Ukraine and the West going forwards.
I would call for a sitting down and talking and looking for a peace arrangement, but I don't think many people are calling for that right now. That was the former editor of Labour List, Peter Edwards, and the executive editor of The Critic, Sebastian Milbank. Thank you both for joining me today. Plenty more to come this afternoon on my Common Sense Crusade. After the break, I have a sit-down with historian David Starkey on why he believes universal human rights do not exist, as we delve into the ongoing debate on whether the UK should leave the ECHR. But first, let's have a short break. See you after this.
Here on GB News Live, we'll be keeping you in the picture, finding out what's happening across the country and finding out why it matters to you. We'll have the facts fast with our team of reporters and specialist correspondents. Wherever it's happening, we'll be there from 12 noon on TV, radio and online. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates. Do you not believe in prisons?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you. She's only teasing. Go on. He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512.
Virgin Media Channel 604.
Freesat Channel 216.
Freeview Channel 236.
And YouView Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB Plus Radio.
With the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Common Sense Crusade with me, Calvin Robinson, on your TV, online and on your wireless. Just before we move on to our next topic, before the break we were discussing the Tavistock GIDS clinics. A Department of Health and Social Care spokesman has messaged us saying, young people who are questioning their gender identity deserve our compassion and support, and we must ensure all services are acting in the best interests of children. NHS England has recently consulted on a new model of providing children's gender identity services, informed by the work of the CAS review. The Department of Health and Social Care supports the work of NHS England is doing to improve the service offered to transgender patients in the NHS, and we welcome Dr. Cass's latest advice. Now, there's been a lot of talk about human rights in the news this week. Former Conservative Prime Minister Sir John Major warned against Rishi Sunak's alleged plan to leave the European Convention on Human Rights if his plans to control illegal immigration are blocked. Also, the Scotland trans prisoner row continues as the Scottish Prison Service said transgender prisoners will be initially put in jails corresponding to their biological sex. A recent review alleged that the transgender double rapist Isla Bryson being put in a female prison did not put female prisoners at harm. Some would argue that this policy from the SPS will infringe on the rights of transgender prisoners. But this all begs the question, what are human rights? And is our current understanding of them based on fact or fiction? Well, I spoke to historian and broadcaster Dr. David Starkey about this a little earlier.
David, what do you think of John Major's comments? Should we leave the EHCR or the ECHR?
Well, there was a very, very interesting remark by Sir Roger Scruton, the late, great Sir Roger Scruton, who said John Major was an experiment in having a completely uneducated Prime Minister. And I think that John Major's comments illustrate the problem in having a fundamentally uneducated ex-Prime Minister.
By uneducated, do you mean didn't go to Eton?
I don't mean they didn't go to Eton. I mean that he has never had a serious abstract thought. Politics is partly about the understanding of the practical world, the ability to deal with people. But fundamentally, politics is about ideas. And if you get somebody with no sense of the world of ideas, and you get the kind of Tory party, a party with absolutely no notion of what conservatism or indeed any other ism, let alone human rights, means.
Do you think human rights exist?
I think human rights or rights exist within specific legal systems. Okay. The great problem is when you come up with this bizarre notion of universal human rights. Now, you would be perfectly prepared, and indeed I imagine have a notion that there is such a thing, because you believe in a deity outside of our individual personal historical cultures who embody such things. I don't.
I would suggest that the UN in their convention weren't arbitrary. I would say they're pointing all the way back to the ancient, well, to the church fathers, but also to the ancient idea of property rights. I would suggest it perhaps goes further than Hobbes and Locke.
What were Locke's universal liberties? They're very few. Life, liberty, and property. Yeah. These apply to everybody. Yeah. What we've done instead, following 1945, we started to produce intensely sectional rights. And the problem with that is the notion of rights is inverted. What they thought they were doing was protecting you, me, every other individual against the overweening power of the state. After 1945, what they did, they focused on small group rights. They focused on the rights of minorities. Now, the moment you do that, human rights find themselves stood on their head. Rather than protecting the individual, they require huge apparatuses of state power. This nonsense in Scotland. Every ordinary person thinks that this woman who was a man who... Can I be really disgusting now? The photograph that really struck me, she was wearing tights, and you could actually see her penis showing through them. Yeah.
That's now, because it's a bloke.
Because it's a man. And it's a physical, endowed, functioning man.
But everyone with common sense knows that it's a man.
And everybody with a common sense, unlike Nicola Sturgeon, knows that it is. And we are required to perform this lunatic, self-denying routine. Now, frankly, I think that the denial of reality is the basis of human catastrophe, the moment you do that. Once you actually start having this minute series of this right, that right, the other right, and again, non-rights like the right to accommodation, the right to education, the right to this, that, the other. Do you know what you finish up with? You actually finish up with no scope for democratic government at all. Everything becomes a matter to be determined by judges, to be determined by committees, whatever. And I'm sorry, this leads us in a position where the thing that was supposed to protect the individual, that was supposed to protect freedom, above all to protect freedom, destroys it.
It's anti-freedom.
It's anti-freedom. The moment, again, that you have a notion of victimhood as the arbitrator of rights, but who determines that order of victimhood? It's totally arbitrary. It's merely the chattering class.
Well, it's not just arbitrary, it's absurd, isn't it?
Well, it is often absurd.
And I think people see that. So is that not good? Because it exposes itself, and situations like this one in Scotland are going to result in the SNP, the Scottish Nationalist Party, plummeting in the polls.
One hopes.
They've ruined their chance of independence.
Well, I mean, all of which I would applaud vigorously. But the trouble is, let's pause, Calvin, in our mutual delight at the collapse of this, and ask another question. What goes in its place? It seems to me that what we need to substitute for this absurd, irrational, pseudo-rational doctrine of rights, we need to invoke our existing fundamental tradition of liberty. We need to understand, I think, that the entire structure of human rights law as it's developed is flawed and is based on an irrational foundation, which is why it leads to the absurdities of Scotland, why it leads to the absurdities that you can't stop illegal immigrants. Can I end by quoting Jesus?
Please do.
By their fruits ye shall know them.
Yes.
And we see what the fruits of human rights laws are. They're universally catastrophic.
Thank you, David Starkey. Speaking about Isla Bryson early this week, Nicola Sturgeon said, "She regards herself as a woman. I regard the individual as a rapist." Apparently there are 3 genders. You're with GB News on TV, radio and online, and now it's time for a check on the news headlines. Here's Bethany Elsie.
Good afternoon, it's 32 minutes past 3. I'm Bethany Elsie with your top stories from the GB newsroom. The number of people that have died in earthquakes that have hit Turkey and Syria has risen to more than 33,000. It comes as Turkey has ordered 113 suspects to be detained in connection with the construction of buildings that collapsed during the disaster on Monday. Some rescue operations have been halted in the country after reports of looting, whilst hundreds of thousands have been made homeless in the middle of winter. The Labour Party is urging the BBC chairman to consider his position after MPs found he breached standards when applying for the role. A cross-party committee says Richard Sharp made significant errors of judgment when he failed to declare that he'd helped Boris Johnson to secure a loan when he was Prime Minister. The chair of the Commons Defence Committee is urging Rishi Sunak to boost defence spending due to threats of a new Cold War. Tory MP Tobias Ellwood told GB News we need more money to replace military equipment and deal with aggression from Russia and China. It follows reports that some NATO allies are concerned about the UK's military readiness. And workers at Heathrow Airport are to vote on whether to stage fresh strike action after rejecting the latest pay offer. Unite says over 3,000 of its members, including security guards, engineers and firefighters, will begin the month-long ballot on the 17th of February. The union says the offered 10% salary increase amounts to a pay cut when compared to the rate of inflation. You're up to date on TV, online and DAB+ radio. This is GB News. Calvin will be back with you in just a moment.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512.
Virgin Media Channel 604.
Freesat Channel 216.
Freeview Channel 236.
And YouView Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB+ radio.
With the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. for Gloria Meets. In exclusive interviews, I'll be finding out who our politicians really are and what they really think.
It's something that you would never want anyone to suffer.
I didn't know what channels there were. I didn't think I'd be believed.
I must have weighed about 7 stone and I'm 5'8".
My instincts was to sort of cover this up. I mean, clearly that was a mistake.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday on GB News, it's Bev Turner Today from 10 a.m. We're going to be here for you, our GB News family, to keep you up to date, but also make you smile.
There's a guy who went from puberty to adultery.
And I can't wait to bring a few of my own opinions.
I have no time for cultural totalitarianism.
We'll engage in passionate, but always polite debate, with your thoughts and opinions at the centre of it all. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you.
She's only teasing. Go on.
He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
Welcome back to the Common Sense Crusade with me, Calvin Robinson, on your TV, online and on your wireless. As I mentioned in my monologue, the Church of England has been all over the news this week because Synod, the governing body of the COE, voted after a lengthy process to allow the blessing of same-sex relationships. They're also considering whether to stop referring to God as He after questions concerning the use of gender-neutral terms were raised by priests. This has caused tidal waves in the wider Anglican communion. To discuss this, I'm joined by Diocesan General Synod member Luke Appleton and broadcaster and lawyer Andrew Eben. First of all, thank you both for joining me today. Luke, well done at Synod. You absolutely owned it. But so thank you for that as a first comment. What do you think about these comments about gender neutralising God?
So, hello. Basically, I was there in the chamber when the lady first mentioned this about gender-neutral terms for God. And she later on, during the LLF debate, referred on several occasions, I think, to the Holy Ghost as she. And I would have thought that she of everybody would want to use God's chosen pronouns. It seems bizarre that everybody else has to have their chosen pronouns, apart from God, who they are quite happy to misgender. But the bigger issue, to be honest with you, is that there's no theological work behind this. It's nothing scriptural. It's just merely trying to be sort of with it and woke and connect with the culture. And it is nonsense. And I've had lots of people write to me about it, saying, if this is what the Church of England's about, I'm just not interested.
I'm quite concerned about the idea, because we know that what the Bible says about people who blaspheme against the Holy Spirit. So to go against the Holy Spirit in that way at Synod is quite interesting. Andrew, what do you make of the idea of a gender-neutral God?
Well, I think people recognise that actually God is neither male nor female. I mean, Justin Welby himself has pointed out that is the case. So then about the question of pronouns and what you should use, I'd say it's a bit of a nonsense if you flip between he and she and so on and so forth. But if you start with the premise that it's neither male nor female, I think that's widely recognised, isn't it?
Absolutely. I would say that God is not sexed. However, God told us how to refer to him, to call him Abba, God the Father, and Jesus Christ was a man, a male, an adult human male. So I think it's quite strange to say that we should not use those terms if we've been given them. However, Luke, I mean, we're joking about this, but this is quite serious, isn't it? Could this risk fracturing the Anglican communion further?
Well, I think it's certainly setting the cat amongst the pigeons at a difficult time. I think it's part of a big something that's been long-standing, where they're trying to get rid of Father, Son, and Holy Ghost and replace it with something like, Creator, Redeemer, Sustainer, and it's trying to completely, change the Bible.
And you stood up and you fought quite valiantly against the proposals that I talked about in my monologue about same-sex marriage as well, and same-sex unions, didn't you? The Catholic Church has a quite clear statement on this. It was put to the Congregation of the Faith: does the Church have the power to give the blessing of the unions of persons of the same sex? And the answer back was negative. Why was it not that simple for the Church of England?
Well, I'm afraid the Church of England is talking out both sides of its mouth, because the Church of England, if you read The Guardian, you think the Church of England has agreed for same-sex blessings, but the Church of England hasn't agreed to that. What the Church of England has agreed to is blessing the individuals. It's like something from Yes, Prime Minister, and they've said they've briefed The Guardian, oh yes, we're allowing same-sex blessings, but then to the Anglican Communion, they've briefed the complete opposite. So if you look at the Communion Service News, it says Church of England Synod votes to affirm current doctrine on marriage. So they're trying to eat their cake, have their cake and eat it, which to my mind is dishonest.
Well, I tend to agree. Andrew, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think it's very simple. I mean, the Church and the Testament has sort of evolved, if you like. What was it, 1889, Lux Mundi, and they sort of turned around, and it was Charles Gore at that stage who was sort of saying that, actually, if you look at Genesis, you don't have to take that as historical facts. The whole thing about creation and so on and so forth. He said, well, OK, it's not absolutely word for word. And a very interesting piece, I've read several interesting pieces, and it's sad to me that it is such a divisive issue. But Bishop John Wigorn, he was basically saying he used to be on the side where say we should never have same-sex marriages. He's now changed his mind because he said, well, actually, science and also the scriptures need to be reconciled. We need to look at new evidence. And the whole bits and pieces about turning around and saying, well, it's not a choice to be gay. It's basically, and we're not quite sure why, but it's scientific. And so he's saying that actually the most important thing is that you have love. It's same-sex and it's monogamous, and love is the overriding factor. And that being the case, I think the distinction between same-sex blessing and actually going the whole way and having a marriage in a church, there should be no distinction.
There's too much there to break apart. I mean, you said it's scientific and said at the same time we don't know why. That doesn't sound very scientific to me. But the problem that I have with your statement is that you said that the Bible is not inerrant. You said the Bible is not God-breathed because it's not literal, it's not all right, and there are bits of it that can be changed and updated. That, I would suggest, is not a very orthodox view. But Luke, I want to put to you, there were 4 bishops who voted against, only 4 bishops who voted against this measure. Who were they, and what do people do now that their bishops aren't orthodox?
Well, one of them was Jill Davis. I would have to look up the other 3. I mean, she spoke very valiantly in favour of the gospel. The others seem to be on board with speaking out of both sides of their mouth and this very hypocritical position. I would just say that the people that spoke strongest against doctrinal change in the chamber were themselves people that identified as being gay Christians. So this idea it's sort of about these wicked conservatives against gay people is completely wrong. The strongest voices against this were gay Christians. And actually Jane Ozanne, for very different reasons, actually voted against these proposals as well. So, from both sides, there is really a lot of opposition to what the bishops have done. I think they put themselves in a very difficult position, to be honest.
Well, I won't talk about those individuals because they're not here to defend themselves, but I did see a lot of individual testimonies of people breaking down and saying, look, we've lived our whole lives chaste and strive towards holiness and lived as the gospel tells us to live, and now you're undermining all of that and telling us actually we could have got married all along and we could have had our same-sex union blessed, and actually all over that hard work has been for naught. That's very, very, very sad. I feel like the LGBT community hasn't been consulted enough in this process. What do you think, Andrew?
Well, I think also, I'm just going back on your point about not taking everything literally, and it's the whole idea about creationism. I'm not sure what your personal views are on that, but it's moving on to turn around and saying, actually, that's one example of where the Bible's not taken literally for absolutely everything that's said. And it's basically different accounts. Various people will turn around and say it's different accounts from different voices. If you look at Leviticus 19:28, one of the things it says is, do not mark your skin with tattoos. So if all the people who've now got tattoos, and several of your viewers will have tattoos, if they're sinners as well, what happens in that sort of situation?
OK, so to answer that, there's multiple issues there as well. Of course, when we go back to Leviticus, as people often do when they're in these arguments, they're confusing ceremonial law with moral law, and a lot of that is not considering that the New Testament is about the old law being fulfilled and how to live your life within God's law. However, I won't get into all of that because it's just conflating the argument, but it's taking us away from this SSM issue here. Luke, I'm going to let you address Andrew, if that's all right, on this point.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that's the issue, isn't it? It always comes down to an attack on the Bible. Can we trust the Bible? Can we trust what the Bible has to say? And I would say absolutely we can. And my point has always been, do you know what? If there was a strong biblical case for same-sex marriage, I would back it in a heartbeat. But no, there was one moment where the bishop, a bishop of London, who spent a long time saying, we've done lots of theological work, was just asked, can you show your workings out, please? Just one A4 document with your workings out. And she resisted the amendment on that particular issue. She's completely refused to. And I would say that the LLF books that we've been given as synod members are insulting. Frankly, no offence to the people that put them together, but they really do not have huge theological depth to them. They're about feelings and experience, and that is not how the church should be doing doctrine.
I tend to agree. Thank you both. We've got to move on now. That was the Diocesan General Synod member Luke Appleton and broadcaster and lawyer Andrew Eben. Thank you both for your time today. The grooming gang scandal has rocked the country, but many of the issues behind it have still not been fully addressed. A GB News investigation seeks to restart a national conversation about this crisis and discover what went wrong, and then what needs to change now. Charlie Peters, GB News' documentary filmmaker, joins me now. Charlie, tell us about why you felt you had to create this documentary. First of all, well done, because it's fantastic. I think it's one of the best pieces of television we've put out on this station so far.
Calvin, it's very kind of you to say. The reason why I launched my investigation into this national scandal is I felt like we've never had a proper national conversation about this issue. When the lid blew off the scandal a decade ago, we never really took it seriously. The conversation was always sort of mealy-mouthed and I think full of correct. And I was starting to become aware that the problem was still around. Children were still being abused, and the authorities who failed so much in the decades before were, unfortunately, still failing.
So do you think there'll be any accountability for what happened?
Well, there will be accountability once laws and new policies are brought in where mandatory reporting is introduced to public officials, and those who witness or hear about issues about child abuse have to then report it up the chain of command. Until that happens, people will always have an opportunity to look the other way cover it up, and fail to act. Now, true accountability also comes when the police are empowered to look into these issues properly, and when independent investigations are launched in the many, many towns that GB News Investigates visited during this investigation. We uncovered up to 50 different towns and cities where there have been credible allegations of grooming gangs taking place. And in exclusive data and statistics we shared last night, up to 1,000 new survivors have come forward since 2020. And one charity we spoke to, the Maggie Oliver Foundation, is currently dealing with up to 100 live cases as we speak, cases that are going on right now. And it's important to stress that these people only come to the Maggie Oliver Foundation because they feel as though they are being fobbed off and ignored by the police. So they are an underestimate that will be much bigger, much more grave national picture.
I think everyone should watch this documentary. I want to thank you, Maggie Oliver, Wasik, Jane Senior and Samantha Smith for their contributions, because it was absolutely outstanding. If people did not see it, where can they go to find it?
It's on the GB News app and it's on YouTube as well. Grooming Gangs, Britain's Shame, aired last night at 8 p.m. And I hope it restarts that national conversation we so desperately need.
Thank you very much, Charlie Peters. Now, before we move on today, let's have a look at what you guys have been saying about the topics we've discussed. On the General Synod, Lacey says, when the Church of England decided to ordain women as priests, dissenters joined the Roman Catholic Ordinariate. Do you foresee a similar situation arise? God willing, Lacey, God willing, I do hope a lot of Orthodox people find a way, whether it's through the Ordinariate or through, if they want to remain Anglican as Orthodox Anglicans, they can join the GAFCON umbrella. But either of those options are fantastic, and I hope people do that and hold the Church of England to account. On transgenderism, Angie says, all children should be the boys and girls they were born as while they are still in school and until age 18. I think that's just common sense, Angie, isn't it, really? Let boys be boys, let girls be girls, and when they grow up into men and women, then they can make whatever life decisions they want. On the war in Ukraine, Anthony says, please remember that when the Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, the USA, UK, and Russia gave an undertaking to guarantee its safety. Russia has violated that agreement. We are therefore morally obliged to support Ukraine in any way we can. I'm not going to comment on that, Anthony. Thank you for writing in, though. Thank you, all of you, actually, for sending in your comments. Protesters and trans activists have clashed on the steps of Tate Britain following the gallery's decision to host a drag queen event for children. Families had previously raised concerns about the gallery hosting drag queens to provide half-term entertainment. Protesters organised a demonstration outside the Tate where they were met by counter-protests led by a coalition of trans rights campaigners. Joining me now is former Eton teacher and cultural commentator Will Noland. And still with me is broadcaster and lawyer Andrew Eben. So, Will, should Drag Queen Story Hour be banned?
I think there's a strong case for banning it, Calvin, and the reason for that is that its purpose would seem to be encouraging in children an attitude towards gender identity that could potentially be damaging. Now, if academics want to have these kinds of conversations amongst themselves and not promote these views to children, that's one thing. But what is its purpose if not to suggest to children that there's fluidity in gender such that a man can become a woman and there's no material difference between the two of them? I'm not clear what the aim of it is.
Well, Will, how is it damaging?
Well, to put it bluntly, a man cannot become a woman, nor vice versa. And there are all kinds of potentially damaging consequences from adopting that view. And the idea that this is about free speech is a curious one, because I used to work at a charity, Eton College, and the lecture that was deemed gross misconduct for its content argued the opposite point of view, which is that biological sex is immutable and we can't change this. And that was deemed too dangerous for 16, 17-year-olds, very intelligent students to hear because a member of staff found it offensive. And yet here are much younger children being presented with what seems to be the opposite viewpoint. So it's not about
juxtaposition. Very interesting juxtaposition there. Andrew, I'm guessing you would consider this art?
I think, well, I'll tell you what I consider, and I like to play devil's advocate because it's important, as Will points out in his patriarchy paradox, to make sure that you do get many different views expressed. If you actually go to the Tate Modern's website, you'll find out what this event is all about, rather than looking at the shocking headlines. And there's a drag artist called Ada HD, who suffers, I understand, with ADHD, and basically they're reading stories to children. And if you, one of the things I went to this Christmas was to go and see Ian McKellen in Mother Goose, and the whole pantomime season and form of people dressing up in drag as a form of entertainment was exactly that. The question which we need to look at, and I haven't seen any reports about it, is what material is being read. So if it's done in the form of entertainment, that has got to be okay. And to turn around and address issues such as ADHD, diversity, celebrating individuality is fine. If the material is not suitable, and it's a point that Will touches on, as I say, in that brilliant video, which got him into all sorts of trouble, then I think that's the thing we should look at and address that appropriately.
Interesting point. I just want to state it's Tate Britain, not Tate Modern.
Sorry.
But it's not the content that's important. Well, the content is important, but not just the content. It's who's reading the content. And the question keeps coming up, not why do children need to be read to by drag queens, but why do drag queens so keenly want to read to children? Will, I want to ask you about the media coverage around this, though, because even the Daily Mail has pushed the far-right angle. Now, I've seen people holding signs saying, leave our kids alone. Doesn't strike me as particularly far-right. I even saw Piers Corbyn there, certainly not far-right. Can you tell us your take on how it's been covered so far?
It is worrying, you're right, that people who are rightly concerned that there might be children who are too young for these kinds of ideas to be presented to them, being exposed to them. So if this is far right, then what we've got is a really interesting shifting of the Overton window. It's moved so far left that views that most people would rightly consider common sense now being described as far right, and the average man on the street will find himself labelled far right simply from standing still while political discourse shifts further and further left. You'll remember that J.K. Rowling, for example, received death threats and was seen as a far-right figure by many for just saying that there really is a material difference between a biological woman and a man with a trans woman.
It comes back to bringing common sense back. Thank you very much for that. That's former Eton teacher and cultural commentator Will Noland and broadcaster and lawyer Andrew Eben. Thank you both. A spokesman from the Tate said, "We do not programme artists in order to promote particular points of view, nor to reconcile differing points of view. Our galleries offer a broad programme and visitors have the freedom to choose which aspects of it they engage with." Each week on the show, we like to end with our closing prayer, the collect for the Sunday called Sexagesima, or the second Sunday before Lent. Here we go. O Lord God, who seest that we put not our trust in anything that we do, mercifully grant that by thy power we may be defended against all adversity through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Up next is Nana. I'll be back next week. God bless. Take care.
Hello, I'm Rachel Ayres and welcome to your latest weather update from the Met Office. Now looking ahead to the start of the new week, and it'll be dry for many with some frost and fog. Though looking across the north, the breeze will start to pick up as these weather fronts start to make a little bit of eastwards progress towards that high. And it will also bring a few outbreaks of rain as we head into the new working week. But back to this evening and overnight, and with some clear spells around for northern and western areas, we could just see a few patches of mist and fog forming. Be mostly cloudy elsewhere, though we might start to see a few clear spells developing in the far southeast towards the early hours that could just bring a few patches of fog. Be a mostly mild night with all that cloud around, but there could just be a patch of rural frost for northern and eastern areas. So a cloudy start to start the new week, though as we head through the day on Monday, that cloud will start to lift and break and will bring some sunny spells, particularly as we head into the late morning and the early part of the afternoon. Temperatures will be once again above average for the time of year, with highs of 10 to 12 across the south. Now, as we go ahead into Monday evening and overnight, with a few more in the way of clear spells, there's a greater risk of frost and fog. The greatest chance of seeing fog will be across the southeast, so we've got the lightest winds through Monday night. Though there'll be some cloud moving into the west, bringing us some outbreaks of light rain and drizzle and a stronger breeze too, so a milder night here. Though with those clear spells, a cooler night in the east and a chance of seeing a patchy rural frost. So into Tuesday, we've got that cloud moving in from the west, bringing some outbreaks of rain and drizzle to the far north and west, with the best chance of any sunny spells in the south and east. Looking through the rest of the week, it'll be generally settled for many, with a few outbreaks of rain towards midweek and temperatures above average.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates. Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.